prospects we haven't talked about since the NFL draft. That is what we're going to talk about today on RotoViz Overtime. Should you want them on your fantasy football rosters for 2025 and possibly beyond? I'm going to dive into the names that were submitted by the RotoViz Overtime listeners and community. I do want to start off this show, Shawn, by giving a shout out. I haven't done this, but over the last couple of days, I was going through some of the YouTube analytics, and I found a new tab that came up and said, like the highest, interacted members of the community. And I want to give a shout out to Kyle's Money, who popped up way up there on top of the leaderboard for the last 28 days. So shout out to Kyle for his comments and support of the YouTube channel. We appreciate everyone who listens in, whether it's on the podcast feeds where you can find all the shows, and of course you can check it out on the YouTube channel as well. Shawn, I did tease this at the end of the show that came out on Monday, but I recorded with Kyle Dvorak earlier this week, some good shows with him talking wide receivers, and a show that'll come out possibly by the time you're listening to this about the zero RB landscape in 2025. So make sure you check out the RotoViz Fantasy Football podcast feed. Lots of shows posting there, 2 a week, where I've had on different guests over the last month or so, but I'm going to have on our boys, Pat Curran and Peter Overzet, Shawn, over the next couple of weeks. Lots of fun guests lined up. So looking forward to sharing those. So make sure you check out that if you're enjoying the shows over here on RotoViz Overtime. We talked, Shawn, through some of our picks earlier this week, including why people should not be moving RJ Harvey's ADP up draft boards in any format. Just, leave that there for Shawn Siegele and myself to select him. But we talked about a pick when we're on the clock where we take Jaydon Higgins. We talked about a 101 where we took Gentry. We talked about an RJ Harvey trade. We talked about a trade off the 102 for Trey McBride and much more. So be sure to check out that show if you haven't done so already. Shawn, listener question time. I'm excited to get your thoughts on some of these prospects. We jump into it?
Yeah, and some of these names a little bit later, which is always a lot of fun. We get caught up. We talk so much about winning the second round is how you win your leagues. It can be easy to forget the spots that some of the guys like a Bucky Irving, a Tyrone Tracy, where they went originally. It can even be something where I look back at the team that Pat and I had where we were trying to defend our title in a 1250 league, which, when you're paying that in entry, it's nice that the first place prize is $7,000. We had selected Jonnu Smith in round 6. So it's this combination of rookies and then the veterans who were cut. Yep. And that's not exactly what the questions are going to be about today, but it's a good reminder that those guys matter, right? And in our push to try and defend, if hadn't swapped out Jonnu Smith for Josh Downs in the final week because of Tua being out, then we would have defended by 1 point as opposed to missing by a handful. Colm, who do we have to start?
Yeah, Shawn, you can tell there by Shawn that will be seared in Shawn's memory for up until his dying days here on planet Earth. So
the last sentence will be the dying breath. Shouldn't have been Jonnu Smith.
Yeah, 1 point. Like points, everything, the feeling, I'm sure, Shawn, you had on that day, all still there with you at this moment in time. But when we look through it, we get the first question coming in here from Angela, and it's looking for your thoughts on Tahj post-NFL draft.
Yeah, Tahj is somebody that I think was the absolute perfect selection for them. And it's one of these sort of rare perfect selections where you feel like good for both of your guys. Obviously, we have a lot of Chase Brown. We really like Chase Brown. Tahj Brooks being selected 193rd overall. I have to even admit that it was a little bit of a surprise to me when I was going through some of the stuff and realized that Samaje Perine was back on that roster. My first thought was that Samaje, as much as we love him, probably shouldn't be in the NFL. At least for the Bengals, he does look like a complimentary back who they don't actually expect to go on the field. It's more like a pure break glass in case of emergency type of play, as opposed to the Dallas Cowboys, who appear to want to start a similarly ineffective Javonte Williams on their roster. Brooks is a lot of fun. He has back-to-back years with over 1,500 rushing yards. He's got the elite evasion rate in 2023. You would have loved to see that continue in the final season, but we know he's a big back who can catch passes. He's probably going to be able to play on some of these downs where last year after Zach Moss got hurt, they went to, tight ends / fullback, H-back kinds of players on some of those passing downs. He's a guy where if Brown has an injury, I think could really blow up. I've talked about him from the perspective of having this really, really good agility score. And for me, obviously the agility score, you have plenty of backs who don't have that and are fine, right? If you're big, you have straight line speed. There are other ways that you can get there. But this is sort of the Doug Martin-esque profile here. We wouldn't expect him to necessarily be the muscle hamster, but this is a guy flying below the radar. I think could be very, very good and seems like a very, very good fit for the Cincinnati Bengals.
And we are going deep here. So he's in your rookie rankings at the moment down at the tier 9 range. We're moving up a little bit here and getting to Devin Neal now with the New Orleans Saints. Question coming in from Charlie saying that more so a statement, but to get our thoughts on it was he thinks he's a very interesting player and could make himself known for the Saints very quickly. Obviously, Kendry Miller is there. We've joked in the past about how the previous coaching regime felt about him, but he hasn't really come in and had any consistent role since he was drafted, even though he was a player we really liked landing in New Orleans. And you obviously have an age in Alvin Kamara, but somebody who is there on a substantial contract that they're not going to be able to get out of for the next couple of seasons. So Devin Neal coming in, where do you see how this depth chart now shaking up? Kamara at the top, but worrying here for Miller mainly?
Yeah, but I think also potentially for Kamara. You think about where he is in his trajectory and what happened to the Cowboys with Ezekiel Elliott. Now with Elliott, it happened much, much earlier from an age perspective, but there was still this element where because they had paid him, they played him a long time after he was really no longer contributing or shouldn't have been out there for nearly as many snaps because those snaps were making the team worse. We look at Kamara and how many fantasy points he scored last year. It's pretty crazy when you consider, again, his peripherals were bad. One of the reasons we were selling him pretty hard going into last season, which certainly from a fantasy perspective turned out to be completely incorrect, but just the rushing peripherals there didn't just decline. Like they fell off a cliff. I mean, he's been a bad running back from that perspective for a long time. And those are the types of things that are very unlikely to go back in the other direction as you get to the age that he is. Now, because of the contract and because of the unfortunate nature of the rest of their offense, where they often have to just throw him an almost infinite number of passes, he may still do fine from a fantasy perspective. It would be pretty surprising if Devin Neal doesn't come in right away and look like the superior runner. Now for Neal, one of the things with him is that he probably isn't a game-breaking type of guy. He may not flash in the way that a lot of these other backs, had they been drafted into this situation, would have flashed. And so you get this contrast. I mean, Neal, though, is just very, very solid, right? You have the 3 straight years with a 1,250 plus scrimmage yards, 20 plus receptions, double-digit TDs. His peripherals are okay. His athleticism, okay. One of the reasons that he was available where they got him after such a strong collegiate career is that he didn't test very well. And so again, when you don't have the great evasion numbers, you don't have the freak athleticism, especially when you contrast it to so many other guys in this class, that part doesn't stand out. But as the note came in terms of fit, this is very, very good because the Saints need someone who can be solid to stabilize so many things for them. It's not like your backup running back is going to stabilize your organization, but it's a nice little piece of the puzzle as they start down a very long road as you try and get to that ultimate goal of having a real NFL team.
So the next player, Shawn, we're kind of working our way up through the tiers, and it's going to give us an idea then. I'm going to pitch a question at the end, Shawn, as to which of these is your favorite of the kind of late round sleepers. They're all going kind of round. We've worked through it here. Brooks going in round 20 as we move up through FFPC ADP of the Best Ball Tournament. And we're going to keep working up from that area towards not the top, but to the 15th round on today's episode. Brashard Smith, Shawn, we talked a little bit about him post NFL draft with a favorable landing spot with the Kansas City Chiefs. Question coming in talking about him looking very thin. Any kind of concerns of him with his frame or his ability to hold up at the NFL level? He is 5'10", 194 pounds. Obviously landed 7th round with the Kansas City Chiefs. Any concerns with his ability to hold up at this next level?
I think a lot of that is just going to be luck, right? You look at the Workout Explorer comps for him. You've got, Tatum Bell, who did a little bit. You have Javid Best and Steve Slayton, who both appeared to be stars before different types of injuries really just cut their seasons off or their careers off very sadly, very, very early on. And then you have James Cook and Jamal Charles. Obviously, if you got anything like any of that, you would be very, very happy. The Brashard Smith deal is weird because you definitely get the impression NFL teams saw it somewhat similarly. I think the players who are in some ways the hardest to get a read on in this class are going to be Jaydon Blue, are going to be Brashard Smith. Brashard Smith is a much more accomplished of the two guys when you think about the 2024 season. And one of the things that I always had to kind of remind myself in my research, maybe this is not a problem for big time college football fans, but certainly it almost does seem to me like it's leaking in here in that, yes, Jaydon Blue played for Texas. I do think that matters. Brashard Smith playing for SMU. They actually were a better team and had a harder schedule than North Carolina, where you get Amari and Hampton. And when you think about it from that perspective and how much better Smith was than Blue, Blue is in this weird situation where, as much grief as we give the Chiefs for their running back depth chart, the Cowboys is probably even worse. Now, Miles Sanders might actually be easily the best back from the combination of Kansas City and Dallas. But that's certainly damning everybody else with the faint praise for Sanders. It also doesn't necessarily seem like the Cowboys even see it that way internally. They're going to have to play Blue a lot, especially after where they picked him. The Chiefs have put it in a context where they don't necessarily have to, and their rhetoric about the selection is weird, right? Where supposedly their plan was to make a pick at running back in round 5. And Brashard Smith was the back who was highest on their board at that point, which if he had been drafted in round 5, even though it's still in that range where round 5 to round 7 probably doesn't matter very much, if any. And yet I do think the perception would be slightly different because a lot of the thing with Smith is just people I think, well, they just didn't care at all. They waited until the very end of the draft. The thing that makes it a little bit weird there, though, is they're like, we wanted to take a running back. Smith was our highest ranked guy, but we also had this other completely random player, and apologies to the random player because I'm sure that he actually is very good. Their case was that he was the top guy on their board by so much that not only were they not going to address this very important running back position to make their offense actually function, but they were going to trade up for that player and in the process give away another pick that might have factored in to taking Smith. They do eventually, as everyone knows, trade 2 7ths to move up a little bit in the 7th and take Smith, which is a funny way to have gone about that. Colm, I guess my bigger concern than Smith's size would simply be that the Chiefs want to slow play this, that they want to both claim that they had a very high grade on him, and yet that it wasn't important. The fact that they very clearly looked at the running back position as one that does not matter, that's not a great sign for him.
It's not ideal, that's for sure. Next question comes in from Rob, and he's talking about his rookie draft and looking through certain players. He said we did touch on Jaydon Blue on a previous episode, but he was wondering if we had any additional thoughts. You obviously mentioned him a little bit there when you're talking about Smith. Where should Rob here be? I've taken Blue in quite a few of these drafts. I find that he's going in an interesting range in the late second in a lot of them. What's your thoughts here on Blue?
Well, in the FFPC Triflex drafting, he is going 301, which is interesting to me. And then I do think he should be a little bit higher than that. To me, once you get through sort of those tiers that we've talked about, the next guys should probably be Jalen Royals and Jaydon Blue. It was, Colm, I'd be interested in your take on this, because you and I discussed the fact that we're shocked Shedeur Sanders is still getting drafted where he is, which, just for context, is 2 rounds ahead of the QB who was objectively much better last year and was selected earlier by the Cleveland Browns in Dillon Gabriel. Now, I understand the idea there, which is that once the Browns did go ahead and pick him, then all bets are off. It's just going to be who's the better guy. And if a lot of people still think that Sanders, and when I say a lot of people, that includes all of the scouts, all of the NFL draft folks who, I mean, one of the things you get a lot of talk about now is that a lot of people had him in the top 10 because quarterbacks get overdrafted. There was a thought that he would go early, that if he hadn't blown the interviews with the teams who were looking at QB, he might simply have gone in the top 10, which you think about the millions and millions and millions of dollars that you lost because of a lack of composure. That, I mean, it's a good lesson to all of us about being ready for big moments, and regardless of what happens in those big moments, to try and maintain your composure. Then you get a lot of the narrative around, well, he was very clearly just a day 2 type of guy. And then if you also have some of this baggage, teams are going to shy away from that. If you're not going to be the starter anyway, they're not going to want anything to do with you. And that does make some sense, right? When you're running organizations, you want things to be as easy to manage as possible. You think about the difficulty of managing an NFL football team, someone who is not a starter giving you a lot of additional, not even necessarily headache, right? But just things that you have to think about and deal with. I mean, that can be tough. So, I mean, I think that makes sense. But certainly, regardless of how you look at any of that, most people are still going to take the approach that probably Sanders is a better pure prospect than Gabriel. I guess that's the part that maybe I'm not on board with. And then you add in where they were selected. But it's interesting because you contrast that with Jalen Milroe, who pretty clearly is going to be the backup. And yet it's so tantalizing because the parallels to the Jalen Hurts situation, the Russell Wilson situation, the Michael Penix situation are so clear in that Sam Darnold is probably not very good and Jalen Milroe might be. And that rushing element, not only for the reality team, but also for the fantasy team, or vice versa. Not just for your fantasy team, but also for the Seattle Seahawks. Ben and I were discussing Milroe versus Blue with a pick that we had at the 209, 210 range. In the end, we took Milroe, and then Jaydon Blue came all the way back to us in late round 3. Now, ADP would suggest that was unusual, but it does, I think, speak a little bit to the uncertainty that people have with Blue, even given this wide open depth chart.
Yeah, and I think the depth chart's going to be very intriguing to see how it shakes out. Like, we have been Javonte Williams fans for quite some time, but it didn't work out at all last season, and it does feel like it's kind of the end of the road in terms of hopes of him being an explosive NFL player. And it's quite crowded, but I think that he could find his way moving up. But you mentioned the Sanders and Gabriel situation. I think that's just kind of maybe whoever was on one side of the fence versus the other, probably having confirmation bias, either that he isn't worth the baggage and the right thing happened that he fell in the draft, or else he's way better and he should have been a first round pick. And now that we should be picking him in such a way that he was still a first round pick when we're thinking about what we're doing here in these dynasty rookie drafts. I would certainly prefer to take Gabriel over Sanders, and the drafts when I've been drafting, Sanders has gone every time at least a round ahead of Dylan Gabriel, and I would much rather, like, I'm very happy to see that pick go off the board and allow another player to get closer to my selection. Sanders may come in and may be, you know, a Hall of Fame NFL player, but it is that kind of thing of, like, if you're already going in to the combine with a way that, like, you're turning teams off to that extent that they just don't want to draft you, the likelihood of, if something's not going right for you in your career in year 1 or year 2 here, and if you're like inactive on game day, or, you know, you run into those sort of issues, I could just see it all blowing up on him, and, you know, this, like, not being a long-term NFL career based on too many bridges being burned, then to, if it doesn't work out with the Browns, to go somewhere else. Like, all the teams passing him so many times, they're probably not going to want to pick him up then, you know, if it's a waiver situation or trade for him. So I think it's going to be difficult for him unless he just, like, blows everyone away at Cleveland and becomes their starter and you know, holds that job down. So I'm on the cheaper side of that bet this offseason when it comes to the rookie drafts. Next question, Shawn, as we go through into kind of a different topic, some trades. Question coming in: if you should make this trade for Rashee Rice, it was to trade Josh Downs, Tuten, a 2026 first that he projects to be late. We talked in the show earlier this week about projecting picks for the future year. It can be very, very difficult. And then a 2027 second projected to be early for Rashee Rice. Would you be moving Downs, Tuten, the first and the second to get Rice, which, you know, we think back to the end of Rice's rookie season and the start of last season, even though he got injured early, and how he was being used in that offense, particularly post the Kansas City Chiefs bye in his rookie season. Very, very exciting as he started that breakout. But now, obviously, coming off the injury, projected to be ready for the start of the season. What's your thoughts here? Too much to give up?
I think so. It's interesting because Rice is in a moment in time where I do think his value could really jump again. Ben and I did a lot of discussion about him on Ceiling Bananas last year as being a viable 1-2 turn pick in, you know, 1 QB best ball. And then you have the off-field incident, obviously early in the season. He looks sensational, but is then injured. You have the late season emergence from Xavier Worthy. And I guess I'm a bit surprised at the relative prices for those guys, that there's not a bigger gap with how good Worthy looked late. And the way he was emerging both as a manufactured touch player and a vertical player, which we saw in the Super Bowl. And now you have added in Jalen Royals. And this is where, you know, being a big Royals fan and a big Chiefs fan potentially causes some problems in my evaluation, because part of what I'm looking at there is just that this is actually a much bigger threat to Rice than maybe the draft slot would suggest. Now, the Chiefs have come out and said they think he's very similar to Rashee Rice, and that's one of the reasons they drafted him. It's one of the reasons they're excited about him. Obviously, they think Rashee Rice is good. They think that Jalen Royals will be as well. We don't know that yet, but purely from a prospect perspective, Royals was probably the better of the two guys. The Chiefs did seem pretty shocked that he lasted to that point, as I was. I mean, Royals should have gone, 50, 60 picks earlier. And we still have, I guess, a tiny bit of concern about the rehab. I would think that Rice is going to be perfectly fine for the beginning of the season. Maybe this package, in terms of what they represent, is fine. When you're talking about trade value, I'm higher than consensus on Josh Downs, higher than consensus on Bhayshul Tuten. I really like having the flexibility of those picks. And so, me, all 4 of the pieces in this trade are probably more valuable, not by a massive amount, but I prioritize those pieces a little bit more than their average value across the community. So that'd be a little bit part of it too. I mean, Downs is tough because I do believe at this point he's demonstrated huge upside and might in fact not be that much worse than Rashee Rice just himself. The problem, of course, is the QB play, and this is something that we keep going back to with the Tyler Warren situation as well. You know, how long do you want to be patient with Warren? How long do you want to be patient with Downs? Will Anthony Richardson improve enough that it's not catastrophic? Will Daniel Jones win the starting job and make the offense work? I think, you know, from one perspective, you're like, well, Daniel Jones wins it, then it's so low upside that I'm less interested. At the same point, I mean, almost certainly Daniel Jones will be a better passer for this team. Are you okay looking forward to 2026 when maybe neither player is in the mix to be the starter? Blair and I are both willing to trade established pieces in risky moves. We were looking at some Rashee Rice trade possibilities where we would send Rice that were for a lot less than this. We didn't end up doing that. We showed what probably will end up being good restraint. I think it makes sense to get Rice. There is a possibility that 12 months from now, we're talking about him as being very clearly in like that Nico Collins range. One of the interesting trades that I saw in one of my leagues this weekend was a trade where it didn't completely boil down to this. I think there was a little bit more to balance it out beyond just this, but it was like 101 and Rice for 102 and Collins. But I think both Rice himself and the Chiefs offense, we're now to the point where Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid have to reprove themselves because we now have multiple seasons where the offense has not been that dynamic. And then you have the Super Bowl meltdown. We're in a little bit different position than we were a couple years ago where anybody connected to Patrick Mahomes, you absolutely had to have.
A trade to grade coming in here from Zach, and I'm interested, John, which side you would rather. It's quite an intriguing offer. Would you rather have Jalen McMillan, Pat Bryant, and a 2028 second rounder, or Jayden Reed and a 2028 third rounder? We are in the situation now, Shawn, where 2028 picks are being traded. It also, when it's in photo form, doesn't look like a real number. But which would you rather have?
Colm, are you suggesting that 2028 will never get here?
I don't know. I've never thought that far.
I'm skeptical about the existence of 2028.
I've never thought that far ahead. 2028, it just looks unusual.
Yeah, so this one is tricky because I do think you should be probably trying to get Pat Bryant almost everywhere. I also think you should be trying to get Jayden Reed almost everywhere. Man, we've talked a decent amount on the show about Jalen McMillan because I had him ranked somewhat aggressively. He was in a range where even paying, fairly substantial amounts would have made sense. You think about that second half of the year breakout. Colm, how are you looking at this Tampa Bay Buccaneers team? Are you seeing any explanations from them about what their plan is? They seem to have accumulated too many players, including a first-round rookie wide receiver who almost certainly is good, but at the same time maybe doesn't move the needle in a way that a fourth receiver drafted in the first round should.
Yeah.
I worry about Jalen McMillan now. Yeah,
before the Ibuka pick, Jalen McMillan was a very exciting player to have in your roster, and the main reason for that also is could factor into this whole conversation. You have Mike Evans, who's 31. You're like, well, Mike Evans, is going to fade out eventually. Last year, he did finish with 1,000 yards. Felt like it was a little bit of a fabricated 1,000-yard season. But you have Chris Godwin, who has now had multiple injuries and was playing quite strong last season prior to his injury, but is also just turned 29. So you have two aging receivers who, at any point, could start to deteriorate in terms of their play, and have had some injuries over the course of the last couple of seasons. So it still has a pathway to him being, the wide receiver 1 or the wide receiver 2 on this roster. You're kind of looking at a picture where 3 years from now, McMillan and Ibuka are the main guys in Tampa Bay, but that's a long time to wait if they're going to be sitting behind 2 established veterans. And that is where my concern would be for both McMillan and Ibuka. I would still like to have them on rosters, mainly McMillan, but there's a lot of squeeze happening here across the board for all the wide receivers. It would make me reluctant to draft either of the veterans as well at their current ADPs. So it's just an offense outside of, if you're drafting Bucky Irving, that I'm a little bit reluctant to dip my toes into, unless you're, thinking down the line. But how we talk about dynasty rosters sometimes arriving ahead of time, there is a chance that McMillan could still, Godwin doesn't recover fully from the injury. McMillan is the wide receiver that's in place of that, and he becomes so effective that he also bypasses Mike Evans for targets as Evans becomes less efficient. So it could be a case by the end of the season he's the main guy here in Tampa, but it is a case that he has some roadblocks in front of him. Do you think there is a chance that happens? I think what we've seen at the end of last season, he showed enough upside that he could become a main guy and main target getter in this offense ahead of Godwin and Evans. But I think that the way it's set up, it's more likely that they have to fade out of the picture before either of these 2 wide receivers become high-end starters.
Well, one of the things that Travis May told us, more than a year ago, was that when you look at those Washington Huskies receivers, that Jalen McMillan is number 1. He's the second best of the 3. And number 2, he's probably closer to a Dunze than he is to Polk. That looks...
Well, that's a good thing. He may be the best of those receivers, Shawn.
Right, but certainly that would be a very controversial take at the time.
Yeah, the Polk gap, though, became he's definitely past that hurdle.
He's past that hurdle. My main point being that Jalen McMillan is probably actually quite good, and so that does change the dynamic. It's almost impossible to understand what the Buccaneers were thinking, because it's not just the Chris Godwin thing, but that they re-signed him. Right. So that makes the aging part of it a little bit
That's what
relevant.
all makes sense if he went in free agency.
Right. Exactly. You mentioned Evans aging out, but one of the problems is that McMillan, Godwin, and Ibuka, none of them seem like a replacement for him as opposed to redundant pieces on each other. Now, I'm always a little bit skeptical of the idea that a slot receiver, there are certainly some players where just very clearly they're going to be one thing. And yet the certainty that we have about how an NFL team will use its pieces, I think, is often overstated to the detriment of fantasy managers, where they assume that something has to be used in a certain way. And the NFL team's like, it's a football player who can learn stuff. We're going to use him in the way that makes the most sense for us. Having said that, there were outside receivers that were almost certainly just objectively better than Ibuka and cheaper. And if you wanted a receiver like him, again, Jalen Royal's probably almost identical to Ibuka as a prospect, and you get him much, much later. A lot of this is just discussing what we think are unfortunate tactics by the Bucs, but it does filter back to this question. Colm, I think this is pretty balanced. As I'm looking at it, certainly Jayden Reed is the piece that you want, but the next 3 most valuable pieces are on the other side. They give you 3 different outs. The fact that one of them doesn't come until 2028 feels a little bit weird, but we do talk all the time about stockpiling seconds. And so this is essentially perpetual reloading, moved out even a little bit more into the future. I would probably still want to have Jayden Reed, but I'm very high on Bryant and I'm very high on flexibility. I would give this basically just a purely balanced grade.
Yeah, and I also think, Shawn, with this trade, if you're setting your team up in a certain way, I think if you're looking to this year and next year specifically, I think the Reed side is the one that you want. If you're looking for like, it's going to take me a little bit of time to turn this roster around. I think the McMillan and the Bryant ones, when you enter 2027, they can be bigger pieces and worth more. And also you also have that future second as well as you kind of continue to stack up that roster. So I think this could work for two teams at the same time, if that makes sense. And you mentioned it being balanced. That probably feeds into that as well. That is where we're going to finish up today's episode. 2 shows this week, Shawn, as we got the kind of rookie draft stuff in earlier this week. People can check that out. Fun show to listen into. We will be back with more content coming next week. I'm sure there'll be lots of stuff up on the RotoViz radio airwaves. You can check out, I teased earlier as well, the shows with Kyle Dvorak. You can check them out on the RotoViz Fantasy Football podcast feed. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on social media at Overtime Ireland. You can check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. Until we are back, have a good one.